CEO accidentally slept on a single dad's shoulder. What happened mid-flight left her speechless. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe and follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. Before he saw her, he saw the thermos. It had been on the passenger seat of his truck for 11 months, read Stanley, dented where it had fallen off the garage workbench on a Saturday in October, and neither man had picked it up until morning, and Silas had driven those same roads since February without once looking at it directly. Out to Strongsville, up to Lorain, down 71 past the county line. The thermos in his peripheral vision the whole time, the way a bruise is felt before it is seen. He was standing in the short-term lot at Hopkins with the door open and the January wind coming through the structure when the fluorescent lights caught the dented side, and he finally looked at it. And in that moment before he moved it to the truck's roof to make room, he understood what he had been doing for 11 months, which was driving around the city with a dead man's belongings, alone. He went back through the sliding doors to find her. He saw Cass before she saw him. She was moving through the terminal crowd with Trace on her left hip and Della on her right, and she had the look of a woman who has long since passed the place where difficulty is remarked upon and simply carries it, the way the body carries old injuries, incorporated, unremarkable. Her coat was the one she'd worn at the cemetery. The twins were asleep against her shoulders, their heads lolled in the loose way of children who trust completely the surface beneath them. Even at that distance, Silas could see that both children had Miller's ears, the particular forward jut of them. He had not anticipated this, and he stood still for a moment in the middle of the terminal with travelers parting around him before he started walking again. "Give me one," he said when she reached him. "I've got them. Cass." She shifted the boy toward him without further argument. Silas took Trace against his chest. The boy didn't wake. He smelled of crackers and the particular sweetness of sleeping children, which Silas had no name for, being a man without children, a man who had arranged his life so efficiently that sweetness of any kind had few places to enter it. He did not think about this. He buckled Trace into the car seat, which took longer than it should have, the clips, the angle, the weight of the sleeping boy, and by the time he straightened, Cass had Della in on the other side. He reached up for the thermos from the truck's roof and held it in his lap a moment before setting it between the seats, where it had been, where it was apparently going to stay. Cass looked at it, her face did not change. "That's Miller's." "I know it." She turned to the yellow wall of the parking structure and was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. He drove them south. The house was in Medina County proper, on a county road where the fields ran flat and colorless to the horizon, and you could stand at any window and watch whether coming from 20 minutes out. Silas had looked at 11 rentals online and driven to 4 of them. He had chosen this one for the school district and the bus line and the landlord, who had answered on the second ring and had not been evasive about the furnace or the roof. He had paid the deposit and the first 3 months without mentioning it to Cass, who had found out from the landlord and called from Lubbock and said, "You didn't have to do that." He had said, "I know." He had meant it as a statement of fact. She had received it as one. He carried the bags inside that first night. She put the twins down in the back room, both of them together under a quilt her sister had packed, and when she came out to the kitchen she found him standing at the window looking at the yard. Dead grass, a rusted basketball hoop, a woodpile that hadn't been touched in what looked like years. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know it." She filled a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it. She was 34 and she looked like a woman who had been through something real, which is different from looking tired. She had cleaned houses for 11 years, the last 6 of them including his, a 4-bedroom Victorian on the east side of Cleveland, good bones, the kind of house that looks occupied from the street and isn't. She had come every Thursday. He had rarely been home. He had left a check on the kitchen counter and gone to whatever property needed his attention, and he had thought almost nothing of her except that she was reliable, which was the thing he thought of most people he paid. Miller had told him one night over bourbon at a bar in Tremont that Cass had mentioned Silas's house. She said it's like cleaning a museum, Miller had said, laughing. She said nothing in it looks like it's ever been touched. Silas had smiled. He had thought Miller meant it as a compliment. There's nothing in the refrigerator, she said. Make me a list. She made a list. He drove to the Giant Eagle and came back and put everything away while she stood at the table folding the children's clothes. They moved around each other in the same room without colliding, without the usual negotiations of space. The ease of it was something Silas noticed and immediately filed away, which was what he did with things he did not wish to examine. He left at 11. He drove back up 71 toward Cleveland with the highway empty, and the snow holding the last gray light of the sky in the fields on either side. His Victorian was exactly as he had left it. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, the bourbon on the kitchen counter, the silence that pressed in from every room the moment the door closed behind him. He had purchased this house as an investment and had stayed because the numbers made sense, and had never substantially furnished it beyond the functional because he was rarely there, and the rooms did not seem to require anything of him. He poured 2 fingers and did not drink it and went to bed. In the morning he drove back to Medina. He brought a receipt for a plumber he'd called about the bathroom faucet and a tube of weather stripping for the front door. He brought the thermos too. Without deciding to, he had moved it from the truck to his garage workbench the night before and found himself picking it up again at 6 in the morning with no clear intention. He left it on the kitchen counter when he came in for lunch. When he left that afternoon, it was still there. He told himself he'd forgotten it. The following Saturday, he did not pick it up. Silas had known Miller since they were 19, when they had framed houses together in a Sandusky subdivision, and Miller had been the best framer on the crew and also the most expensive friend Silas had ever had, because Miller lent money he didn't have and bought rounds for people whose last names he didn't know and came home from every job with less than he'd started with and seemed to find this funny. They had been friends for 22 years. Silas could not identify the mechanism by which this had occurred. He was not a man who made friends easily, or at all, after a certain point, except that Miller had simply not allowed the distance Silas kept around himself, had walked through it the way you walk through a screen door, as if it had no real substance. The aneurysm took Miller in his garage in February, rotating the tires on Cass's car. He was 41 and in good health and dead before the paramedics arrived. Cass found him when she came home from a house she cleaned in Pepper Pike. Silas was in Denver, signing papers on a mixed-use property when his phone showed the missed calls. He signed the papers. He flew home the same night. He did not understand, then or later, how the ordinary work of a day could proceed uninterrupted alongside something like that, how his hands could keep moving while something essential went out of the world. But they had. And he had driven to the hospital, and he had stood in the corridor, and he had looked at his oldest friend through a window, and he had been, in ways he would spend the next year not recognizing, alone in a way he had not been since he was 19. He drove down to Medina on Saturday mornings. This was what it became, not a decision, just a pattern, the way water finds the low ground. He kept a list in his phone, the porch board, the gutters, the window latch in the twins' room. He spoke with the landlord. He fixed the small things himself. He stayed for lunch. He drove home in the dark. Cass had found a job by March, reception at a pediatric office in Wadsworth, Monday through Friday. He did not understand the architecture of her days, the drop-off, the bus schedule taped to the refrigerator, the pickup, the dinner, the baths, the readings, the particular negotiation of a night during which 2 two-year-olds decided independently whether sleep was acceptable, except that she built it and maintained it and did not describe it as difficult. The twins learned his name by April. Trace said at first, "CUs," with the imprecision of a child still mapping the distance between hearing and speaking. Della said it a moment later with her characteristic exactness. "Silas," flat and clear, like something established. He brought things. He was aware this was not subtle and he did it anyway. A wooden train set, a bird feeder for the yard, a window unit for the upstairs in July when the heat trapped itself under the roof. Cass accepted these things without ceremony and without the particular brightness that people perform when they want you to know you have been generous. She simply incorporated them, the way she incorporated most things, and this was somehow more difficult to bear than gratitude would have been. In August, while she was washing dishes and he was drying them, he had started drying dishes sometime in June. Neither of them had commented on this, she said. He would have liked that bird feeder. He would have taken it apart to see how it worked. Every time, she handed him a mug, every single time. He set the mug in the rack. Through the window above the sink, Miller's thermos caught the last of the evening light from the windowsill where it had been sitting since May, between a small cactus and a coffee can of rubber bands. He had stopped thinking of it as something to retrieve. It had simply become part of the kitchen's topography, as fixed as the coffee can, as the cactus, as the bus schedule on the refrigerator. He had looked at it every Saturday for 4 months and said nothing and done nothing, and this. He understood now. Holding a dish towel in a kitchen that wasn't his was the most honest thing he had done in years. He drove back to Cleveland that night and sat in his kitchen in the Victorian, and the silence of the house settled around him immediately, as it always did, and he sat with it for a long time. He had told himself, for 22 years, that he lived alone because he preferred it, that the 4 bedrooms were an investment, not an absence, that the unremarkable routine of his days, the properties, the drives, the bourbon he rarely finished, was the shape of a life chosen deliberately. Sitting in his kitchen in August, with the dish towel still over his shoulder because he had forgotten to leave it in Medina, he understood that preference was the wrong word, had perhaps always been the wrong word, but the right word would not come, and he was tired, and he went to bed. The following Saturday, he drove back down to Medina. The pipe burst on a Wednesday night in January, 14 months after the airport. Silas was at his desk looking at a spreadsheet when the phone lit up at 2:20. "There's water." Cass's voice was steady in the way that is harder than panic. "The bathroom coming under the wall. Della's had a fever since dinner and I cannot find the shutoff and a pause, a small breath. I don't know what to do first." "Hall closet," he said, already standing. "Access panel in the floor, don't touch it, I'm coming." "You don't have—" He hung up. He was in the truck in 4 minutes. He drove 71 south in 32 and thought of nothing the whole way down except the road, which was the only time in his life his mind went quiet without effort. Water was sheeting across the bathroom tile and working under the baseboard into the hall. Cass stood in the hallway in a bathrobe with Della against her shoulder, the girl fever-red and breathing in the shallow, accelerated way that makes a parent's chest tighten. Silas went past her without stopping. He found the panel in the closet and got flat on his stomach and reached into the crawl space. His arm submerged to the shoulder in water that had been sitting against cold January ground, and found the shutoff valve in the dark by feel and cranked it closed. The sound of running water stopped. The house went quiet. He lay on the floor a moment longer. Then he pulled himself out and got up. His shirt was soaked through, and the cold had settled into the shoulder joint with the particular persistence of January cold, the kind that stays. He did not mention this. He went to the kitchen and came back with towels and started laying them across the bathroom floor, working from the far wall toward the door in overlapping rows methodically, not being asked, not asking. Cass had taken Della back to the bedroom. Trace appeared in the hallway at some point, barefoot, a stuffed bear hanging from one hand, regarding the scene with the frank inventory of a 2-year-old determining whether alarm is appropriate. "Hey bud, back to bed." "Della sick," Trace said, by way of information. "She's going to be fine, go on." He considered this, decided it was sufficient, and went. The mattress creaked. Silas wrung the mop into a bucket and carried it to the back door and poured it into the yard and stood in the January cold with the wet patches on his shirt going stiff in the air. The yard was still. Dead grass, the basketball hoop, the woodpile, the neighbor's light making a long orange rectangle across the fence. His shoulder ached. His lower back had a thorough opinion about the floorwork. The sky was beginning to change at its eastern edge. Not dawn, not yet, just the black thinning somewhere far out over the fields, the dark becoming slightly less of itself. He went back inside. He left a message for the landlord. He dried what could be dried. He stood in the hallway outside the bedroom door and said quietly, "How is she?" "Coming down," Cass's voice through the door, "I think." "You want me to stay in the hall in case?" The door opened. She looked at him, the wet shirt, the shoulder he was holding differently than the other, and stepped back from the doorway without speaking. He got a blanket from the closet and lay down on the floor at the foot of the bed. The floor was hard. He did not remark on this. Above him he could hear Della's breathing, shallow and rapid, and Cass shifting against the headboard, and at some point Trace migrating back across the mattress to curl against his sister's legs. The house made its small sounds. The cold pressed at the windows. Silas lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and was, for the first time in memory, not thinking about anything. Not a property, not a return, not a contingency. Just the ceiling, just the breathing above him, just the particular quality of a house at 3 in the morning when everyone in it is present. Trace shifted on the mattress. Then, in the clear small voice of a child surfacing briefly from sleep, aimed at no one and everyone, the word. "Dad." Not a question, not directed. The word a child says when it is simply the name of the largest thing in the room. Silas did not move. Cass did not speak. Della breathed. The house settled. Something happened in his chest that had no language. Not grief, not relief, not happiness. More like the feeling of a door that has been warped shut by years of weather finally releasing its frame, no one pushing it, no force applied, just the wood deciding. He lay still and felt it open and did not try to name it, which was the first uncalculated thing he had done in as long as he could remember. The cold from his wet shirt had moved all the way through him and come out the other side as something that was just cold, just temperature, just the January night doing what January nights do. He lay there and breathed, and above him the children breathed, and the house was full of the sound of people sleeping, and people keeping watch, and the small vocabulary of a life being lived in close quarters. And he stayed exactly where he was, on the floor in the dark, which was where he was supposed to be. He showed her the Canfield Road listing in April. 3 bedrooms, a garage with a concrete floor in good condition, a lot with a dogwood tree that was already in flower when they walked the property, white blossoms against the gray Ohio sky. The kind of thing that happens in Ohio in April before the cold remembers itself and comes back one more time. The price was under market by enough that Silas had spent 20 minutes confirming the comparables, looking for the defect, finding none. He made the call from the driveway. "You don't need to do this," Cass said, standing in the empty kitchen with Della on her hip and Trace crouched over a heating vent in the floor, operating the lever with the focus of someone learning a system. "I want a garage," Silas said. She looked at him. He looked back. They had spent enough time in the same rooms that silence had developed a syntax between them, and this one said several things, none of which either of them spoke aloud. "What would Miller think?" she said, not a question. Silas watched Trace move on from the vent to the window latch, which was stiff and required both hands. "He'd say something loud," he said, "and then he'd say fine." Cass was quiet a moment. The dogwood outside the window dropped a handful of petals in the wind. "Yeah," she said, "that's about right." They moved in May. Silas took the room at the end of the hall, the one with a window facing east. He drove to Cleveland on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He handled the properties by phone from the kitchen table in the early mornings, before anyone else was up. He paid for the house, which was not a sacrifice by then and had not been for some time, though he could not have said precisely when the accounting had changed. He learned that Della liked her eggs scrambled dry, not wet, and that Trace would reject anything green until the summer when he inexplicably began eating cucumber slices, regarding each one before he ate it with the expression of a man considering a contract. He learned that Thursday nights were the nights Cass stayed late at her nursing coursework and needed the coffee made and left in the pot. He learned that she hummed when she was concentrating and that the hum changed when she was tired, dropping in pitch and losing its melody, becoming something between music and breath. He knew these things the way you know a place you live, not from study, just from presence. The slow accumulation of a life in close quarters. Miller's thermos came with them in the move. It had been on the windowsill in the rental, and it went to the windowsill in the new kitchen, which also faced east, which also got the morning light. It sat there through the summer and into the fall, the dent catching the sun in the afternoon, and Silas looked at it every morning and said nothing and picked up nothing and went about the work of the day. In November, Della brought home a drawing, 4 figures in front of a house, a tree beside it, its crown a ball of pink crayon, too tall, too small. She handed it to Silas in the kitchen without introduction and went to find her brother. He stood and looked at it. He put it on the refrigerator. Cass came in and stood beside him looking at the picture. Her teacher told me what she said about it, she said, when she was drawing it. What'd she say? This is my family. Cass said it the way you report weather, as information, not commentary. That's all, just that. The tree in the drawing was pink, which was wrong for November and right for how Della understood the house. By the month it had become a house, which was April, not the month they moved, which was May. I didn't correct it, Cass said. No, he said. She was close enough that he could have taken her hand, and he did not. And she did not leave either. And they stood for a while in front of a child's drawing on a refrigerator in a kitchen in Medina County, Ohio, which is not a thing that means everything and is not a thing that means nothing. Outside the window, the sky had gone pewter. The snow's coming, he said. I know, she said. I saw it. In February, he found the thermos above the refrigerator, in a cabinet he used for extra coffee and things without a better place. He took it down and held it a moment, the dent on one side, the red paint worn at the handle where a hand had held it for years, and then he brought it to the sink and opened it. The smell that came out was faint. Old coffee, a long time closed steel. He washed it with both hands under hot water and dried it and set it on the counter. Trace found it the next morning and turned it over in his hands the way he turned over everything new. What is it? Thermos keeps things warm. The boy examined the dent with one finger. Can I take it to school? Silas filled it with apple juice and screwed the cap on and handed it down. Trace took it in both hands with the gravity of a child entrusted with something that belongs to the actual world, something used, something that has been places. He loaded it into his backpack and zipped it shut and ran for the door and the bus, which did not wait. Some mornings now Silas is up before anyone. He stands at the kitchen window with coffee in both hands, and the yard is still dark and the dogwood is bare, and the neighborhood is quiet in the way of places where people are still asleep. He has stood in many kitchens in many mornings, and the feeling was always the same feeling, a man in a house, at a window, looking out into the dark, and then one morning the light in the twins' room comes on by itself, before he goes in to wake them, because they are old enough now to begin the day on their own, which is something that happened without announcement. And he stands at the window and watches the yellow square of their light fall out across the dead grass and along the bare arms of the dogwood all the way to the fence, and he does not move, and he does not move, and the coffee warms both of his hands.